Yes, please.
Can you guys see this?
Yes.
Yes.
All right. Hello, everybody. My name is Timothy Cobo, and for me, a hybrid building is one that blurs the lines between public and private, and it allows different variations of habitable space that can be accessed from a variety of ways. And so I'm going to brief everybody on so last semester, we were pretty much asked to design a precedent, to research a precedent, and mine was the Los Manantiales, which is in New Mexico, which is designed by Felix Candela. And what was interesting about this project is that he used 4 intersecting high bars. And the building is actually a freestanding form that doesn't require any sort of structure. And it works entirely in compression. All the compression works acts on the groins of the intersecting high bars. So these are also some 3D modeling steps that we had to figure out how to 3D model this form and really understand the complexity of the geometry. So for the first exercise in this semester, we were tasked to subdivide a cube and to sort of populate these hypars and to manipulate them in strategic ways. So for me, in step number 1, you can see that I selected 2 hypars and I have them intersecting similarly to how the precedent did, only I'm doing it on a different axis. And instead of having 4 intersecting hypars, I really just have 2, but I'm creating these 4 interstitial spaces within these 2 intersecting hypars.
Tim, I'm sorry, you have like a Zoom dialog box open on top of your drawings. Can you move it or something?
Yeah. All right, so I don't know how to oh, okay. All right, cool. So then after I created the 2 intersecting hypars, I then placed 2 more hypars, which would act as circulation, which would allow you to access these different planar elements. And then by adding platforms, I then have a cube that is fully habitable. So this is some pictures of the physical model that we built at the beginning of the semester. So moving on to the site, I selected Hunter's Point because of its proximity to the water. And there's also a lot of transit that happens around that area that provides a good opportunity for access into the project. So then I overlaid some of these field lines that I pulled from the first exercise to create interesting spaces and to align to the context. So the immediate context is, the field of lines is sort of connecting to the immediate context. So then the next step was for me to place these units onto the site and start working on bridging connections between the different units. And then in the next diagram, you can see how, what I did was I pretty much created these peel away spaces, which unwind from the lower height bar on the ground floor. And you'll be able to see it in 3D a little bit more in the presentation. So this is an aerial view showing the transit in the area and how the proposed bicycle path and jogging path connects to the existing context and the urban framework. So in this diagram, I'm going to be showing program circulation and also the skatable surfaces and green spaces. So essentially what I did was I separated the program into three different units. So I have unit A, which is the recreational center, which has a skate park and predominantly all the outdoor activities. And then unit C is the educational facility, which is directly connected to the middle school, which is across the street. And unit B is going to be retail, it has a bookstore and also a community library. So this is showing all the circulation that's happening throughout the site. I have basic walkways that connect you from the different units and on top of the roof surfaces, which become habitable. And then the bicycle path also wraps around into the site and allows you to access the different portions of the project. And same thing with the jogging path. The jogging path is primarily around unit A because that's where the athletic facility is. So this is the diagram showing all the green spaces as opposed to the skatable surfaces, which are in the blue. And you can see that there's a direct connection between the two different types. I wanted to sort of blend the basic function of a roof and allow it to be skatable. So the whole idea is that the entire project becomes a skatable project where people can find a variety of spaces that they can just hang out and skate and enjoy it. So for program, the skate park is along the water. I did this because I wanted people in the skate park to be able to enjoy that experience of being close to the water. And then the educational facility has all the program that's required. So the classrooms, the indoor classrooms, outdoor, digital library, roof terrace. It's all sort of placed really close to the existing middle school. So this is another view showing how the program works and sort of how people can sort of access these different spaces from different points in the project. Another thing that I need to mention is that I'm proposing to place a building mass on this, in the overhead lines, the dashed lines. The idea is to propose a building mass to increase the density of the site to populate these structures, since the scale is a little bit larger than it probably needs to be. So I'm proposing to populate the area with increasing the density of people with the building mass. So this is a ground plan of one of the units that I decided to focus more on. This is showing how people can access this building from both sides of the project. It's not limited to one access point, and it's done with also a hyperbolic surface, which is then turned into a staircase.
Tim, just 1 or 2 minutes more.
Okay, I'll start the video.
Let me ask everyone real quick. I'm not getting the video, Tim. It's just jumping between slides.
Yeah, I mean,
Are you all able to see it smoothly?
No, I only saw images.
Yeah.
I can
Tim,
show
either play it on YouTube or let me play it on my screen just so they can see it.
Yeah. I mean, if you can play on your screen, that's fine.
Okay.
Let me stop.
Okay, I have it here. Ready? Can you all see this?
Okay.
Great.
I also have some renderings too, because I know the video wasn't that, it was kind of like glitchy.
Tim, share your screen again.
Yeah, so I have some of those renderings, where is it, right here. So this would be, one of the.
Tim, we don't see your screen. You have to share your screen.
Oh, give me a second. Okay. Can you see it now? All right. So this is a view showing the access and sort of how the building can engage the public in different ways. So every layer of the project becomes habitable. You can access the roof and all the indoor levels, outdoor levels. So this is the other pavilion, and you can sort of see how the underside of the structure becomes this open space and it sort of unwinds into an amphitheater. This is another view approaching it from the pedestrian crosswalk. And yeah, it's pretty much it. I have like the boards as well. I have all the boards here.
Why don't you just cycle through the boards and leave it on a good summary board?
Yeah. So this is the site strategies with the bridging of the different units and the peel away spaces, the different levels of one of the units. This is sections, all the site diagrams, the renderings. There you can see like how it's more like how the project is engaged by the public more. And these are some details to show how some of the things that I worked on work. So I designed a footing to capture, you know, this point of structure. And then I also designed this staircase, which unwinds it, sort of like a winding staircase from the ground floor, and it continues up into the mezzanine space, which becomes the public library. And this is the cube, and then Candela Research. And some more renderings as well.
Okay, great. So why don't you end on a good overview?
Okay. Guess this one?
Sure. Yeah, this is good. If you can go full screen. Maybe you can just summarize for us one more time, Tim, while we're waiting for the jurors. And you began by introducing the idea that a hybrid architecture, you defined it. Maybe you could redefine it and kind of point to it in this image.
Yeah, so the idea is that I would blur the lines between the public and the private by creating spaces and programmatic, blurring the programmatic lines by creating habitable spaces on these rooftop terraces and allowing skaters to come and have multiple skatable surfaces throughout the project, and then to also incorporate landscape to help create a hybrid system where the building is not just composed of architectural elements, but that there's also an atmosphere of vegetation along the project as well.
Could you also speak to how, like, your precedent was different than a lot of the other ones that we've seen so far today with the four intersecting high pars?
Yeah.
And how does that sort of programmatic idea and maybe the lessons from the precedent translate into your thinking about how you developed your project?
So for the precedent, the restaurant was pretty much on a singular level, and the high bars only acted as a roof condition. You can only see it. You couldn't really like activate it by walking on the surface. It was more of just a roof condition that you can see. And so I decided to sort of invert that and to make my project fully habitable, and so that you can interact with these high bars in a variety of ways. And the whole thing with the intersecting high bars, I decided to do it in a little bit of a different way. They did it, Felix Candela did it by intersecting it 4 times. And I pretty much just took 2 hypars and intersected it, and then created 4 interstitial spaces within those 2 intersecting hypars.
So you translated it into kind of a hypar parking garage, at least in the cube model, or like a series of landscapes or something like that that worked in section.
Yeah.
Is that how you want us to read it?
What it is I pretty much subdivided each unit to create different levels that you can inhabit, and just the program is then defined by hyperbolic platforms.
I think the clear difference, Mark, is that in the Candela one, they're drawn. Interestingly, they're drawn and modeled, without computers, by the way, but drawn, and they're intersected and trimmed, which is where the curves come from. But the pieces that are trimmed off just go away. So you almost don't even understand that organizational diagram by looking at the resultant surface. So Tim left the overlaps and then programmed the interstitial space between them.
Yeah, so that actually comes maybe a little bit to my question relative to the role of this hybridized system, form, material, and program. And as you start to look at something like these hyperbolic paraboloids, how did you start to understand the programmatic hybrid or the material hybrid relative to those formal conditions or formal spatial conditions? It seems like there is some attempt to show that calibration. And that's maybe the first question. I have a follow-up to that as well, but
yeah.
maybe try that first.
So what I did for that was I pretty much tried to maximize the level of visibility. So I didn't want there to be like a visible separation between the programs. So a lot of it is outdoors. A lot of the ground floor underneath each of the units becomes park space or amphitheater space. And I think that allows the program to connect together, and it provides interesting opportunities for the program that's above it, because they can sort of see this level of transparency, and they can sort of view these different programmatic conditions that are happening outdoors on the ground level, and also on the roof terraces adjacent to them. So as they're looking out from these spaces, they can see the roof terraces that are being accompanied by people, and that's what I went for pretty much.
But how does I understand. I think that's good. I also think that the overall drawings and everything are really well conceived and well presented. So kudos on that. But I think the question for me becomes like, how does it suggest one kind of programmatic intensity versus another one? I mean, there are some that are sort of ubiquitous, and like a flat surface can hold a lot of different kinds of programs. But as I start to introduce slope or spatial compression, certain kinds of programs go away and others kind of emerge. And so like, what kind of granularity do you understand that kind of like gradation, even though it might not be explicit, but how do you understand that implicit kind of programmatic suggestivity that either the materiality or the formal kind of condition gets you to?
The audio cut off. I couldn't hear the last part of what you were asking.
Well, what's the relationship between your geometry and the programs you're using, Tim?
It's better.
No.
The geometry influences the program. For an example would be that each of the units are oriented towards the water, obviously, and so that becomes like, for example, unit A is going to be the gym because of its proximity to the water.
No, not time out. Let me just clarify. It's a good question. I think you've thought about this. A gym requires a flat floor, right? I can't play basketball on a hyperbolic paraboloid ground, right?
Right.
Flat court. Some of the things we were talking about earlier today, like certain programs need orthographic layout. In fact, racquetball courts, those things, they need to fit into rectangles and boxes. So how do you, I think Clay is asking, you have such an abundance of freeform surfaces and hypars. How does that influence your thinking about where you locate programs?
Yeah, I hear you. Well, although the racquetball and basketball courts, that's all happening on the ground plane. And I did take into account how these hyperbolic paraboloids would be habited by the program. Like I know for a public library for Unit B, I definitely thought about how in Stephen Hall's project, how he terraced the building. So I knew I wanted to terrace the public library so that you can sort of see these different like views from the interior, but while also maintaining the hyperbolic planar element on the ground floor. So like, so here you can see like how the soft shape of the height bars are still visible from inside the public library. You can see like how that height bar comes up from the floor and meets the roof. And even though it's terraced, you can still experience the form from the interior.
Yeah, I think that could be, I think if you start to take that, you know, I keep looking at the previous image where, you know, you see the really intense kind of curvature almost become vertical. And so like, even if you think about the materiality of that curvature relative to the program that it's suggesting, or even the planting, like if there's planting that's more associated with human activity, and then as it moves into a vertical, planting can become different. You know, for me, I'm looking for those little moments of sort of granular difference, even in something that's sort of maybe formally kind of universally continuous, right? And I think you're starting to show that maybe in this drawing, but that was the kind of the crux of the question. So I think as a sort of second order kind of like development of the project, that level of texture and granularity of change from material or green or whatever it happens to be would really make the project kind of go to another kind of level of amazingness.
Yeah.
I like these enlarged plans, Tim. Like they allow us to see how you solve some of the issues of geometry and program. And I like those little moments of terracing, even though, you know, others may not. I mean, there was a side elevation view where it seemed like the slope of the high par was too steep. So you had to, you know, kind of put landings for stairwells and things like that. And in a sense, those misalign. And I don't know, you know, it's a challenge to overlap those things. But, you know, I'm curious what others think.
Yeah, that stuck out to me a little bit, but I know that it's a difficult problem to solve because you lose the sort of purity of the curvature, and that's just something we got to reckon with as architects. But the thing that struck me is I think it's really beautiful work. There's a misalignment between the sort of language of blurring and the initial sort of statement, and actually how discrete everything ultimately feels. Like I think that there are sort of strong boundaries between things, even though there's this kind of sectional manipulation. Like to me, it feels like there's not a lot of blurring happening in the project. And maybe it's one of those things that potentially you want to start off with, you have a thesis and then sometimes you got to modify that thesis. So I don't think it may not be as much about changing the design at this point as it is about sort of rethinking the power of the idea. Because to me, those things aren't matching yet. And I think that's what Clay's questions are sort of leading toward. So you may just want to re-examine your own thesis and your own conceptualization at this point.
Yeah, well, I mean, the thesis is essentially using hyperbolic parabolas to create interstitial spaces. It's not so much about blurring program, it's more about creating different interesting spaces that can be used for a variety of reasons. Like the roof terraces can be used for event spaces or just for park space, or that was the idea, but I understand what you're saying.
I'll just jump in. Two things. One about sort of the investigation of the precedents and then the sites afterwards. The first is, I have a feeling, and I didn't come with you guys, but I know there was this sort of great moment when you guys actually had the Candela drawings in front of you, and I got, you know, all the little pictures, and I was upset I missed it, but I think the Candela thing, there's two parts of it. It is about geometry, but it is also about materiality, and I think one of the issues here is that I don't feel that second part. And I say that because the Candela work these are structures that work, meaning they have great utility. They're solving solutions of very banal solutions away, whether spanning over a large place or whatever. And they have a kind of ordinariness because of the sort of simple work that they do. They are obviously exquisitely beautiful because they do so in such a remarkable way, and you can be infatuated with the thing, but to divorce it from the sort of simple work these things do, I'm much suspicious of that impulse. The other part is to follow my colleagues is this idea of the site. And I think really the issue is the autonomy of the pieces, that they really tend to be too far apart from one another. And I would say one of the things, I did visit the Stephen Hall Library with you guys, which I did like quite a bit, but it is a strange building in many ways. It's an object, right, that has a tendency to want to be a sort of wall that's facing a view. And it struggles with doing those simple things for a number of reasons we can talk about. It's probably more internally concerned than it is really about the view. But you have to say its remarkable thing is that it's, you know, stretched vertically so that you can see the city. So I wonder if two things could enter here. One is that these things would close quarters and get a little closer so that their interactions, because I think the nicest parts of the presentation are the sort of views caught between the paraboloids, the sort of when you're in it, and the kind of framing that these things do. And I think the closer they get, the sort of more accidental interstitial moments will occur, and that would be better. The other one is to be very deliberate about the sort of idea of the view. And I think that's really about the placement of the three boxes at the beginning, that sort of impulse, a diagram that says this is the general stratagem for view, because you can't ignore it on that site. Manhattan is sitting right there. Again, talking this broadly, I mean, again, I do find the axons and the diagrams quite alluring, and I appreciate the project in many ways. But those are things I would just, you know, maybe think about a little bit, you know, in retrospect here.
Yeah. All right. Thank you.
I think that's a very interesting kind of perspective relative to sort of the much larger urbanistic kind of impulse of the project. And I think this idea of how close things are together is super interesting. You start to talk about that locally, right? Relative to, or even my question or Mark's question about like the difference or the gradation of certain kinds of programmatic kind of uses, but like at the urban scale that starts to work as well. And I think if you take the notion of that Jason's bringing to the table is like, for me, I would follow up by saying, can you apply the same kind of logics that are happening at the building level to the urban scale, right? Which is about subtlety and shifting and changes of section or changes of relative spacing of things that are happening at room scale or at floor scale, but maybe not at urban scale yet. But that's a good driver for the whole project.
All right, thank you.
All right, guys, great project, Tim. Thank you. Great comments, guys. I'm going to try to keep us on schedule so we end at 4. Marianne, you're next up. All right. Marianne, is you're muted.
Sorry. Okay, sorry. Oh, I'm back. I said that thank you so much for being here today. I really enjoy the crits so far. I wanted to introduce my precedent analysis before I start into my project. The precedent that I chose was the San Vicente de Paul Chapel, which is a chapel located in Coyoacán, Mexico. This chapel is a service building for a bigger complex that was a nursing home in Mexico by Felix Candela. The design of the chapel is pretty much 3 hypars that are connected in the middle by a different glass and steel lattice structure that connect these 3 hypars. So that's what makes a difference between the other hypars that he created. After that, we took a look at our cube and we created our own iterations of the cube. For my cube, I created a quadrant on the first plane where I had 4 hypars that would connect, in the first floor, and then they will go up. As they go up, you can have these 4 hypers either closed as shown here or open as shown here. And then it will repeat on the top plane. The resulting elevations is what allowed me to start my design for my project. My site is a little bit different than the rest. I decided to go across the river and go towards Roosevelt Island. We went to the site when we were in New York, and the connection between nature, it reminded me of the President Project of Felix Candela, because he did have a lot of vegetation in this nursing home chapel that he created. So I kind of felt a connection between both sites. I placed my elevations, my 2 elevations, the 2 most appealing elevations into the site, and I confirmed it into it. Then based on that, once I placed them on the side, I saw what the opportunity was to take advantage of the few views of Hunters Point and Manhattan. Based on that, I laid out my program, which was 4 buildings that are connected by landscape and different programs of hardscape. So the 4 buildings are the Learning Center, which is this building over here, where the classrooms and the shelters are. This big amphitheater, which has an underground access for a small amphitheater underneath. This small building that is kind of a hybrid connection for both buildings, which has a cafe for people that gets out of the amphitheater and has a digital library for people that access the classrooms. Then in between the buildings, I have a playground and I have a small skate park on this side. One moving forward, I have a bigger skate park that connects behind the amphitheater. And lastly, I have the fitness center. Most importantly about the Felix Candela is the projections of the line into the site, and of course into the building itself. So this diagram shows more of the scaffolding structure or framing structure that he originally used to create the thin shell structures.
About 1 minute left, Marianne.
This is how the site looks right now. This is exactly where the site is located. This is a treatment of the surface and materiality. I pretty much created a play between different surfaces, and I wanted to introduce landscape to connect in between the buildings, the playgrounds, and the skate park.
Marianne, I don't know if you can hear me. We only have about 1 minute left.
Okay. So there's my enclosure diagram and my circulation that shows the path for the site itself, the vehicular path, and then there's a smaller path for the park itself right now. I have a video that I'm gonna show. Yeah, and I have some other zoom-in images and some views for the skate park in this case. Then I have the interior of the amphitheater and some sections cutting through the spaces, the amphitheater section, the cafe, the fitness center over here. It's kind of explained out here. And the learning center and playground that has the underground shelter for the learning center. The playground over here that has some concrete or hardscape slides. And that's it.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Marianne. We have about 8 to 10 minutes for comments, guys and girls. Can you go to an overview, Marianne, that shows? There you go.
Over here, or
you pick an overview image.
there we go.
I think for me, like the most successful image that I saw in the project was that moment where you're coming on this up the stairs in between the two planes, and then you come up onto this rooftop. I think that was a really nice gesture in how to use this kind of structure system for circulation. I'm not sure which image that was, or if it was just in the video.
Yeah, that was nice.
Yeah, that's the classrooms, the exterior classrooms over here.
Yeah, I think it's that moment I think is really nice, and I think that's something that you know, I think a lot of the projects that we've seen today could potentially capitalize on using those spaces. And I think that moment is pretty nice.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that, also relative to that, there's the space before that, the sort of landscape kind of move that leads into that space. I mean, I think what that starts to show you is that there's some stuff that could happen on these figures, on these surfaces they're the building kind of surfaces that could start to articulate again, like some subtle differences, even some sort of just banal criteria like handrails and things like that could start to be introduced into the project that I don't think would detract from it at all. What I liked about this project as well, I mean, on the lower right-hand image, I think the landscape moves start to be pretty satisfying. It also seemed like maybe, and you can maybe describe this a bit more, it seemed like there's some stuff starting to happen relative to the surfaces of the buildings themselves. There's some sort of pillowy looking kind of articulation. I couldn't quite tell, but I think those kind of moves could start to be maybe even more driven toward program as well, or suggestion of program.
Yeah.
Was there something happening in the surface? Did I see that in one of the renders?
Let me see which one is it that you're talking about. This one?
It was a sort of, it was the underside,
I believe.
Those are the only rendering. This one.
maybe it was in the video. It was probably in the video. Sorry.
Yeah. But I think I have other images that show that part.
No, Marianne.
It's okay. It's okay. It's okay. I was just curious. Yeah.
Why don't you just go to your video and just pause at the spot that he's talking about?
Which part is it that you're talking about?
No, I don't
Towards
know.
the end. Yeah, keep going.
I actually find
Just
the
passed
lack
it.
of materiality in the video a lot more satisfying than the
Did you?
renderings. Yeah, I don't know why. Like
Yeah.
for some reason, the attempt to realistically render this one seems to undermine the kind
Interesting.
of sculptural
Mhm.
qualities of the form. I don't know why. Like this is one that I think works a lot better. The images in the video to me are more compelling than the kind of quasi-realistic renderings and the kind of landscape texturing and all that sort of stuff. Like
Mhm.
I sort of want this one to be just like a weird abstract park with a bunch of like follies and sort of heroic scale chapels. Like that's what it
Mhm.
feels like to me. I don't know. Like
Mhm.
there's something about this, and the thing that I didn't quite pick up on in the presentation is the unique, like, situating this thing on Roosevelt Island, and the fact now that you have two horizons or two skylines to deal with. How does that influence the strategy?
Mhm.
And there's a lot of opacity in your project, and I was just sort of curious about how, like, these sort of larger vistas through and larger openings through that are suggested in that in-between space that was brought up, the big grand stair leading up between the high bars,
Mhm.
like that's the project to me. The buildings are sort of a result of those larger um, kind of outdoor panoramas. I don't
Mhm.
know.
Mhm.
I think
Totally.
it's
I mean,
like I
there.
love this image
Yeah.
way more than any of the renders where you try to make it look like concrete or look like grass or whatever. Like the abstraction here, because the buildings start to become a little bit more, the pavilions become a little bit more ambiguous with the ground, and the sort of texturing and the patterning is really contributing a lot here, that it's sort of lost in the other images. So as you start to represent this, um, I would go in this direction for me.
Awesome. Sounds good.
Although that's also counter to what Jason was talking about, and the importance of Candela's work is the sort of, and I think important to
Materiality of
Nick
it.
too, is the sort of materiality.
Yeah.
But I think what you've done though is more successful without it.
Thank you so much.
But that's a super interesting question in general, though, too, right? Like in terms of if a level of abstraction is actually the desirable actual outcome of that thing, what would you do in terms of detailing or material finishing or all of those kind of important questions that would happen at the next level of development of a project like this? How would you do that to maintain that abstraction, right?
Or yeah, it's an interesting research question, like what happens to Candela without the tectonics?
Yeah.
Like what happens?
Yeah.
What's plastic Candela?
Yeah.
Or
What-
Pomo Candela.
Pomo Candela.
I don't know if you guys know, but we found in our research that often Candela was not even the architect of the buildings. There were different architects who hired him to basically design a roof over the plan. So, what David was saying earlier today about the orthographic, the efficiency of orthography works well for ball fields and ball courts and certain programmatic elements, but then orthographic doesn't really work so well for structure. Here we're more in the family of like Pierre Louis Nervi and DSA and things like that, and isostatic lines of force. And I think, just to clarify for you, Clay, they did this intermediate step where they took their precedent and they had to kind of multiply it inside a cube, changing it from like a roof surface, like an object, to a space, and then deal with the spaces on the site.
Yeah.
And Marianne, I agree. I think this is so great. I mean, this is such an excellent image. To me, it addresses both sides of the site. It's kind of, the grain is oriented towards both edges. And I think it's a challenge, I know, but I agree. I think the individual views are not quite right yet, but it's there, So I think study a few more views. And I agree. I love the rendering style. Also, all of Candela's drawings, like if you look at the surface, this is for the jurors. We've talked about this a lot. If you look at the surface, it's hard to understand what's happening in terms of surface structure and geometry. So when Candela would draw them, he would always project lines onto the surfaces. So
Yeah.
and I see that happening here in a false way. Three-dimensionally, your surfaces that are high bars have no lines, and then the flat ground plane has lines which seem to suggest geometry that isn't there, which I find interesting, right? But anyway, great work. We have to keep hustling. We're speed dating.
Thank you so much.
Good job. So next we have a
Nice project.
We have
Thank
Kevin.
you.
All right, Kevin, are you ready?
Yeah, can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, my name is Kevin, and this is my master's project. And I'm gonna start with my site. So we had seen the site in the morning, but just to refresh, I'm in the manufacturing part, the northern part of Hunters Point. And this is a site that's very interesting because it has these remnants of the manufacturing times where there's these ponds that we're not quite sure. They look like retention ponds on the site. And I wanted to work around them and fill in kind of the blanks left behind in the open land. On the right side of the screen, I'm just showing how the southern point of Hunters Point has been an area that has received a lot of recent development in high-end residential, whereas the northern part is still kind of lacking in that sense and still manufacturing. But there is the possibility for that to change. My cube study from the precedent, my precedent used two intersecting hypars. So on the left, I placed two intersecting hypars into the cube. And what I focused on was the steps that I used to create the cube. So actually using the framework and subdivisions of the cube itself, along with the system of the hypars, and then trying to bridge between the two and then create these spaces in between. So the next step is that we took one of the elevations from the cube and we placed it onto the site, which is on the left. And with those lines was just adding another layer of information on top of those ponds that are existing. And what I started to do is use some of those lines to make the circulation of the site and figure out how the public would access the site. So one thing that I mentioned was leaving the ponds pretty much as they are, but creating ways to bridge across them and also a boardwalk along the river. So these pathways are at different levels, and I'll show that in a following slide. But then on the right, I started to place the programs within the leftover space between the ponds and the pathways. So here's a zoom into one of the buildings on the site and just showing how I started to use the overlaid lines to create a framework as I did in my cube, place the hypars within them, and then place the program. And I'm gonna show that in the next slide also. So here's those steps I'm referring to, creating kind of like a framework to create an edge for the hypars for the building. Then the hypars themselves that are intersecting and overlapping, which was similar to my precedent, and then enclosing them and creating those program spaces within. So this is looking at those same three steps on the entire site and how they came together to create the design. Here's the full site with the building and the walkways, the boardwalk that I mentioned. And I break it down. Basically, I broke down the program into two groups. There's the physically active group, which is the skate park, gyms, playgrounds, and racquetball. And that I placed along the riverfront because in those areas of development in southern Hunters Point, the riverfront is one of the most important spaces for the public. And there's a lot of exercise, jogging trails, and things that go along. So I wanted to continue that up into northern Hunters Point. On the urban side, the side towards the street and the manufacturing area, I placed the intellectually active programs. So that's the libraries, the classrooms, and the theaters. And I placed that here to try to spur community development in that area and bring people to the project. This is a floor plan. So it's showing how the major axes are what were created from the overlaid lines. And then in between is where I started to place the programs under and above some of the high pars. In the second level, you can see where I'm trying to create spaces between the high pars and bridge between the high pars and the framework. So this is a section that is trying to show that in a way that can be easily understood. But I'm creating the second floor level cafe and lounge area in between the overlapping high pars. And there's also the element of the framework that can be seen, the columns and the beams. Now this framework is more of it's not a structural because, as has been mentioned, the candela forms, the high pars, they are structure, they're capable of pulling themselves up structurally. So this is more just to frame the spaces. So here I have a couple views of the exterior, like the main entrance from two different sides. This is that interior space when you would enter, and I started to figure out ways to use the high pars to place, like here, a grand staircase. And I also wanted the programs not to be subdivided just like one high par per program, but where they kind of start to overlap into areas that have multiple high pars. So here's a view of that second floor cafe space when you come up that grand staircase. And that's when you would start to have views back towards the Manhattan skyline. This is showing one of those ponds and like the pathways that are created along them, and the two systems, the high pars and then the framework, and how they're kind of clashing and creating new spaces between them. And this is that elevated boardwalk along the river that I wanted to create a jogging path also to continue from the Southern Hunters Point.
All right, Kevin, one or two more minutes.
Okay. And on the bottom, the skate park and racquetball courts, the more active part of the program. And then I have a really quick walkthrough of one of the interior spaces. So this is the main entrance from the urban side, the street side, and that grand staircase. And then it's showing under the high part where I placed the library space. Back outside to those walkways over the retention ponds. And then a view back to the building where you can see the two systems. And that concludes my presentation.
Great, thanks, Kevin. Can you go full screen on this?
Yeah.
Kevin, what are these things right here?
So as I had mentioned, the walkways that are over the ponds are slightly elevated. And then the other walkways are at grade. So those are like ramps that people can skate on, but also people can walk on to kind of negotiate between those two heights of the paths. So it creates also where the skate park is not only just in one area, like people can skate through the site to reach the main area of the skate park. And it also starts to change the ground plane as well.
And you see these long catwalks being used like publicly accessible extensions of the pedestrian and bike paths, or more internally used within the complex of buildings?
Well, they do lead from one side of the site, one street, to on the other side of the site, another street. So it's something that it has the possibility of being accessed across, but also, you know, internally, where it's a jogging path, where there's places to sit and enjoy the view. So it's it leaves it up to the user.
I'll just say I like how these services start to fill in and create surface and maybe like thicker joints between these thin linear elements. You know, almost like webbing on your hands between your fingers. I think those could be kind of special places. I would love to see this, you know, these things start to align with that, even if you had like stitch it together. You know, and listen, I like your project. Uh, it's hard for me to resist drawing on it. Because you clearly have like these three overlapping systems. The site is such a strong layer. Clay, we had this site earlier this morning. It's this really mysterious site where there's this jetty that blocks it off to the east. This is this old utility building, and these are like cooling ponds of water with weird objects in them that you can see from satellite. So two students looked at the site, and they kind of thought, you know, we're not going to pave over these and just, you know, wipe the footprint of these weird objects here. But Kevin's strategy was to put catwalks, which would allow you to, you know, walk over them, look down into them, connect between thin linear elements and these thicker surface elements. And so I'm curious what you think about those things. But yeah, Kevin, I mean, you've got a clear, you know, you've got a clear layering of different types of organizational systems. And it's interesting. I don't know that it's ever resolved, but to me, you know, I like those parts where they start to line up and then split apart. And I think, you know, I'm curious what everyone thinks, but even this, I would love to see this, or like maybe the path comes around here and starts to line up with the pond, and this facade starts to line up with the path. I don't know, this view in particular, I'm just noticing all these misalignments, and maybe it's about that, but that's not what you said. So, you know, I'm just wondering about those things.
Yeah, I mean, to me, those are kind of those misalignments are part of the overall strategy of the project, from what I can tell, in terms of, because to me it's a collage kind of based or palimpsest, or, you know, whichever one you want to kind of think about. So it's not about this sort of hybridization so much. It's about sort of things doing their own thing, and then sometimes they push into each other, but they never kind of like merge or hybridize. Maybe that point in the middle that you were noting, Nick, is maybe the one place where that kind of starts to happen. But everything else kind of maintains its own kind of like identity, and it obtains other kind of stuff from those collaged interactions, but they never kind of merge together. And maybe that's a good thing about the project in some ways. I think some of the interior spaces, like the library space where you had the shelving kind of like tucked in underneath, is one of those moments, maybe programmatically, where that kind of happens and it doesn't try to merge. It kind of maintains its own autonomy. And I think that could be maybe a successful path forward with the project. But I feel like it's a different kind of project than a hybridization project, which is fine with me in many ways. But I think it's important to understand that.
Maybe, yeah, and maybe Kevin, you know, maybe this is like Mark was suggesting to Tim, like maybe it's just a kind of revision to the thesis statement. I mean, maybe it's not a hybrid geometry or a hybrid building, but the hybridization occurs in the way that users are constantly toggling between this and that, right?
Yeah.
Existing between these three overlapping systems, and you're the connective glue. instead of something built.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But I,
and some of the research about the hybrids, like it's kind of ambiguous, like what is a hybrid, you know, and whether
Yeah. Good
a
point.
hybrid then loses those characteristics of its separate parts, you know, and like you mentioned, you can clearly see like the separate layers in this project. So it's been a back and forth, like trying to understand that.
but I think there really is an opportunity to use that running track. And I like the webbing and the finger analogy, like to
Mhm.
really make that not just a running track, but a kind of richer spatial promenade, whatever, that it's not just an athletic event, that it is a pedestrian path to experience these beautiful cooling ponds and the skyline as well.
Mhm.
I think there's something there.
Yeah,
Okay.
I agree. And I mean, we talked about it a lot, Kevin. It's always, your project's always had a very retro uh, feel to it, even though Candela is probably older than the retro I'm referencing here.
It is. Yeah.
But it's nice. I mean, there's something nice about it, like Parc de la Villette, uh, you know, the Wexner Center, a few of these references
Yeah.
that I like, and I think it's. Yeah, I'm glad that this project is part of this studio because it's a unique take on it, and I think it defines it with new categories, and I appreciate it for that reason.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Those are great references. Those are actually the references that are maybe most appropriate to this project. But I think you should look at those. But I think it actually fits in, not just aesthetically, but it fits into those programmatic kind of intentions of those projects, and maybe Lavalette in a very explicit way about how it does take the person interacting with these things to sort of fulfill and make the loop. And so I think that's a really good note that I would follow up on if I kind of position the project for portfolio or awards or something like that.
Yeah, great work, Kevin. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, man. Talk to you soon. Thank you. Next is Cecia.
Yes, hi. Can you guys see my screen?
Yeah, you have the same moon that Fatin had.
Yeah, I guess so. Okay, hi, my name is Cecia. The project focuses on stabilizing form through the use of hyperbolic paraboloid shells, the process of how to rationalize complex geometries into components that can be built. Really quickly, I'll go over my president. It's the San Jose Obrero. This specific project consists of two hypars, a structure that allows free space inside thanks to the fact that it supports its own weight due to its shape. These two hypars are balanced on 2 points. The same concept was taken into account for my cube, placing the hypar counterbalance one another within the midpoints of the cube space. The intent was to make the hypar a hybrid use where it becomes a wall and transitions into a floor or a roof. In my project, I also created areas, interactive areas, where the hypar becomes areas for sitting down, playing, ramps for skateboarding, and accessible roofs. From my cube's elevation, I created a grid. I specifically chose this one and placed it on my site. My site is located on the edge of Hunters Point and Newtones Creek between 56th Avenue and 2nd Street. The site is surrounded mostly by mixed use and industrial buildings. Also, there is new development around the area, which will invite more people to the site. And there's also a train station nearby. So this new, what I like to call a new urban paradigm, I created it through the grid, which connects to the main axis of the site. I later then took the hypars of my cube's elevation and placed it within that grid. This would create pathways and amp spaces for different activities. The program is organized according to noise activity. For instance, I placed a skate park, gym, playground along the outer edge of the waterfront, while the quieter spaces are placed opposite to that, the library, theater, and classroom. And in between, we have a communal area where one would find the cafe and bookstore, which is circulated by a jogging path. Right now, we'll show you my video and run through of my project. I hope you guys could see that. Thank you.
All right. Is this the slide you want to stay on, Saskia?
Yeah, whichever one.
Yes, okay. Can you go full screen on this?
Yes.
It seems like the scale of this one is slightly different than the others. Could you describe that a bit more? I really appreciate the scale of this project.
Yeah, so if you were to look back into my president, this was a church and it was 180 feet by 90 feet wide. So I really took into consideration the scale that he used for this church. There was images from inside that he took where you see a very ample space within it and these high volumes as a roof where he penetrated these like ribs in between to provide light. So I tried to use that same and play with the scale and height within my each like module that I created within my grid.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel like it's successful in that I think it creates a lot of some spatial subdivisions as you move through the project, but also the sort of urbanistic kind of like qualities of it I think are moving in the right direction. I think you could play with those gaps, between a bit more, or how the cuts happen so that it's not necessarily just a vertical cut in the, between each one of those overall sections. But I think the overall quality of the project makes a lot of sense. So I can get in smaller groups of like, 30, 40 people. So it's not such a massive, you're not looking at 2,000 people having to occupy this to make it seem like stuff is happening. I think that's a pretty successful strategy for that, kind of edge location.
Thank you.
Yeah, it feels very humane.
Yeah.
And the thing that, I guess there's something about the grid that is disciplining the HYPAR here, and I don't think they have to match as much. So like, I'm wondering if there's a way to like create another scale of grid that works through it, or like really smaller maybe, that you get some sort of finer articulation and undulation and things that maybe fits more the like small scale park site that you're working on. I think that's one of the things generally that that I've seen today is like, I guess designing a HYPAR, I'm learning, is like connect the dots, and like somehow whenever you guys do the connect the lines.
Yeah.
And I think that somehow when you guys draw a regulating line or a grid or something like that, you always see that as directly matching how the HYPAR works at that scale. And I think that the thing that I keep thinking about with the skate park is how much like diversity of shape and profile is there. And that somehow if you're a skateboarder, which I'm not, but you go up to it and immediately you can kind of look at it and sort of assess, like, this is the kind of skating that I want to do right now, or this is the trick that I want to practice, and this is the kind of figure that I need to work on, or this is the part of the skate park that I really want to work on. So there's a certain, like, even though it feels continuous and kind of lumpy or whatever, like a landscape, there's a lot of difference in there that I don't see in all your different pavilions. And I'm wondering if there's something that could be there.
Perhaps. I also thought about creating like a second grid within each like module, but that was towards the end and it got like too complicated, and I wanted to keep the simplicity that Felix Candela had on his president. And then sort of like having them meet at a certain point that he had, rather than just like have them maybe put in their randomized.
Yeah.
And then having them like sort of interact with one another within those points.
Well, it's I guess the point that I'm trying to make is when I look at the roof plan of this, it's all triangles. And if you had a couple more rectangles that became expressed in the roof plan, it would make the HYPARs weirder.
Yeah.
And you have some rectilinear parts of the program. And so I'm just wondering, like, yeah, I don't know. I just, I'm looking for something. I'm looking for something maybe that I haven't seen yet today, and not that that's a specific comment to you, but I just think there's more potential here geometry wise than the triangulation of everything and then the warping of the line.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
I think
in a way, go ahead.
No, sorry, go ahead.
Well, look, I mean, no, it's true. It is unique in the sense that this one is probably maybe the most consistent with what Candela would do, in the sense that the ground kind of remains a flat ground, and these are primarily roofs that maybe touch the ground. And so, in that way, there's a real consistency to it, and not maybe Jason Chandler would like that for that reason, because you kind of keep that relationship. One thing I would say is that, I think the homogeneity of the path, like the width of the path throughout, that I think that's what makes this seem urban, like a street grid, an extension of the street grid, even from the context. But maybe one thing, I mean, as you were walking through that animation, Ceci, I was just thinking, this is New York City. I mean, people, and I'm thinking about people trying to social distance in New York City right now. Those are so tight, those spaces. Maybe they become special instead of awkward if they operate as like a secondary, like internal circulation system, perhaps like an ant farm, and maybe all the separated pavilions. I think you started to do this when we talked about it. Maybe they all become connected up above, like a continuous landscape. So they meet at the edges. You could occupy this thing as a homogeneous plane, or you could go underneath it and where it becomes subdivided, things like that.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
I think that goes to the scale question.
Yeah.
That Mark just brought up, because I think maybe there is a sort of localized kind of like set of operations that are happening that create these pavilions, but then there needs to be maybe one more scale up of connective tissue. And that's what I was actually wondering relative to the site strategy to begin with, because I think it was already split before you even did some of this other stuff. And so like if you went back to the site and created an overarching kind of like version of this, then you could come back and do these subtle things, and then it would help you recalibrate maybe some of those spaces between to create openings sometimes, but sometimes it's covered. I think that sort of variegation would be really nice. I think you could actually go one more step down and create some more texture at the level of surface, but I think that would really enhance the project. But like I said, I think it's a really well scaled and pretty thoughtful approach here that you've started down.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Cecia.
Thank you.
Next up is Ada. Guys, I realize I'm crunching the numbers here. Oh, no. We're right on time. We're perfect. Keep going. All right, Ada. Ada, your microphone is muted. Start over.
Okay, hi. So I'm gonna start talking about the site that I chose. So my site is located under south of the Hunters Point South Park. The reason why I chose that one specific block was because it's close to both transportation systems, one being the ferry terminal in the water, and then on the other side, the Long Island City train station. The reason why I chose that lot was because I looked back to my precedent that I worked on in my seminar class last semester, which was the Coyoacan Market located in Mexico City. And it just basically took over the umbrellas that Candela designed, took over the whole block. So here you can see my site diagram. Basically what I did is that I took my cube that I created this semester and just placed the 2D elevations that I had onto the site. What I found interesting is that for my concept of the cube, what I kind of did was I tried to connect each high part together using specific elements like planes or sticks. So when I designed my project, I saw the connections of the high parts that it had to each other. So with that, I kind of used that to place specific programs within the site and kind of having the programs connect to each other because of the high parts. So with the programs, I divided it into 3 sections. The educational, recreational, and then other being the cafe/bookstore and also seating area. What I tried to do is have the educational programs more on the right side of the site, and then the recreational kind of towards looking to the water and kind of bringing that landscape that water edge has that a lot of people walk on to kind of incorporate it into the site. Here you can kind of see the ground manipulation that I did, where I took these high pars and I kind of created some elevated areas, as well as dug down into the site to create a theater under one of the high pars. Here are the enclosures, and then the landscape. So one of the things that I did with the high par is I basically kind of used a high par to divide two programs. So on top we would have an outdoor classroom, and then under would be a kid's playground, and it kind of had a connection because since both of them are different, where one of them is more of an educational program and the other one's recreational, it kind of connects within the high part. And then I did the same thing here where the theater is underground, and then on top there's a skate park where people can either walk on or they can skate. So here's some views.
I like that one.
And then I'm going to show the video right now.
All right.
Um,
About a minute left, Ada.
okay. So then for the rest of it, I'm just going to talk about my precedent and the cube. So for my precedent, I had the Coyoacan market. Basically, it's a market in Mexico City that has 21 umbrellas that are connected to each other. And it's created by these 4 high pars that are kind of connected onto the edge. So with that concept of the umbrellas, what I tried to do is I tried to create these 3 transformations where I would connect the high pars with different elements so the high pars can connect each other. And then those are my elevations and plans of it, and then my cube.
All right.
So here's my site. These are my floor plans. So on the top, the white spaces are the ground floor where you can see the racquetball and the basketball area, as well as the coffee shop and the classrooms, and then the theater. And then the second floor, the only second floor there is on the top right where the digital library is. And then here are the programs overall. And then the renderings, the details, and then the key project.
Great. Okay. So why don't you go back? Go back.
Está bueno. Mejor que no está haciendo nada.
Maybe here. This is nice.
700 pesos por semana. No worry. Hay mucha gente haciendo guardería ahora, imagínate. En los versículos horarios.
All right, great. Thank you. Thank you, Ada. Yeah, I think this might be the place to sit. Or do you have like an overall, maybe go actually, that you have an overall rendering of this, I think. A similar view. Oh, okay. All right. There's a few things that I'm curious what the jury thinks. You know, Ada's project sits inland a little. You know, it's kind of neatly here in the urban grid. And at some points we discussed connections over to here and, you know, how to access the water given the, you know, given the potentials of the site. So maybe that's a way to start it off a little. I'm curious what you guys think about that. And
I thought it was a great move. And one question is, what is supposed to be built on this site, or what's scheduled to be built?
On that, oh, where she's occupying?
Yeah.
All right, go ahead, Ada.
I'm not really sure, but I know it's closed off. And on either sides of the site, the 2 blocks where the buildings are, it's also empty.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'll just say this both to you, Ada, and to the entire class. This is, do the research, you know, try to figure out that there's a master plan out there. It's been published. It probably will only take a few seconds of Googling to find it. Most likely the building that's going to be built there is just going to be a tall condominium tower or apartment tower, just like the ones all around it. I mean, that's the plan. But it's worth doing the research just to find out, because there could be something worthwhile there. A couple of things I just want to say. I want to praise the decision to use that site, though, because one of the things that's been really bothering me about the projects that we looked at this morning was how many of them obliterated parts of the Hunters Point South Park, right? And this is this absolutely amazing landscape by SWA Balsey and Weiss Manfredi. I mean, it's a great park. And I did not like how cavalier people were about just paving over it. I mean, it's kind of like the opposite of what we should be doing as designers, whereas what you're doing is taking space that is really going to be used by pretty banal tower and capturing that instead as public space. So bravo to that decision. A couple of things about it. One is that whatever that avenue is behind you, the backside of this this image, there's that street front is really important, and I like the way that your project steps up there, because it starts to take on the scale of the buildings around it, and it looks like what you're really concerned about is how you construct a real street to make that street something important. And so I think that that's a really important move, because also something that a lot of people have done, and you do it elsewhere here, is that when you bring those high pars down to the ground, they tend to create, basically they're a shell, right? They're literally a shell, and like a shell creature that uses its shell to protect itself from predators, these shell buildings are absolutely impenetrable from the outside. And so if you bring any kind of a shell down to the ground, you've got to be aware of that, what you're also doing is creating this kind of insular, like I'm a turtle in my shell kind of thing, where, you know, people can't even imagine being invited into that building. It's not a great way usually to treat the public realm. And so I'm just saying this because to praise you at that side of the project, you lift the building up, open it up, and it's just much better creating a street front. What I would say is that I wish that you were braver about how you treated Center Boulevard or whatever that avenue is that separates the waterfront from your park. Like basically all you guys are you're so kind and kind of timid. Like, I'm only going to do the stuff inside my little, property. Screw that. No, I mean, this is a project where that boulevard is just 2 strips of asphalt on either side of a strip of grass. I mean, that's like the default, like child's drawing version of a boulevard. Instead, take those kind of fantastic ways that you're marking the landscape and draw those across into the park, right? Make it so that if cars travel over that space, they're coming through your project rather than your project having to stop for the automobiles. There's no reason why your project should stop. It should continue through to the waterfront park. And then the one other thing I would say too is that I love how you've taken every roof surface and made it accessible, right? So you've taken this idea that these high par surfaces are kind of amazing from below, and that they can also act as a horizontal divider between program elements, and thus the entire roofscape is accessible. I love that part. But if you're going to make the whole thing accessible, then be intellectually honest with what that entails. So 2 things. One is that if you're going to have green stuff up there, that green stuff has roots and it has a thickness. So those shells can't be the same thickness and section as the ones that are just paved. And the other thing too is, how do you treat the edge of these things, right? Because you have to put up some kind of a handrail, right? You learn that in comp or something, right? You have to have something to keep people falling off of that. And right now in the video that you did, you're just showing this kind of like nominal rail. It almost looks like it's an equestrian facility. And instead, what I would say is think about what that, no, and I mean that as snarkily as I said it. It looked like you were supposed to jump a horse over it. Don't do that. Instead, what I would recommend is, and it's not a detail I invented, but take the glass walls that you've got, those sheer glass walls that are right at the edge of the high par roof, extend them past the edge of the concrete and bring them up another 42 inches to create that simple, whatever, that thing that prevents people from falling off. And in that way, what you could do is create a really elegant kind of a detail. It's almost like you would be putting the high pars behind some kind of a vitrine so that people would, whatever. You know what I'm getting at. So those are the kinds of details that I think really need to be studied here. But on the whole, the response to the site, I think, is really powerful.
Thank you.
Was there ever a thought about bringing the high par geometry down to the ground plane, not in terms of touching, but in terms of articulating the ground in a high par way in your project?
I tried doing that. Let me see.
These things I'm circling are high pars on the ground, Clay.
Yeah.
Okay, that's what it seemed like it might have been that way. So, okay.
Do you have a rendering? Can you zoom in on that, Ada, and show us in one of your renderings?
This one.
Okay. Oh, so that piece was, okay, okay.
Clay, did you have something else you were going to add?
Oh, go ahead, Mark. I was thinking something, but go ahead.
The thing I like about the site, and I totally agree about how it should be more directly engaged with the park across the street, the Hunters Point South Park. I love this one because it suggests to me that you thought of the site, you could have thought of the site as a box that you carved away at with the high pars, which I think is a completely different scheme than what we've seen today. Almost like this is urban infill, and then the job of the high pars is to create the public space and the ways to engage the center of the block. And it would make that roof even more useful because you'd have more flat spots. Mm-hmm. And it would make the spaces themselves way more dramatic. Like adding, let's say, 2 or 3 more floors to this thing, and then really cutting away at it, like using the high pars as a Boolean rather than as a, like, everyone seems to be treating them as a sort of surface or an envelope.
Yeah.
And so, like, to me, that's when I saw your scheme, it made me think, like, what a powerful move that could be. And so I do like yours because it's the one that sort of is trying least right now to be like an object or like a landscape, and it's trying to do something else. And I guess I'm just saying try and do more of that, because I think those are the best parts of your project.
Thank you.
That's great. All right, Ada, good work. You're You're slightly frustrating because the amount of work you're able to do in the last week, I just did not expect that, you know. But you know, congratulations. I think it's really come together, and it ends in a great spot. So you know, thanks for your hard work.
Great. Thank you.
Good work. Diego, you're up.
Yes, sir. Can you guys see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's not this project.
No. Okay. Can you see it now?
Not yet.
1 second.
I gotta say, that looks awesome.
Yeah, I was going to say, I thought he's going to start talking about the hypars being generated from the catenaries of the utility lines.
Japanese utility lines.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
an esoteric point of departure, but why not?
Okay, how about now?
Yes. Go ahead.
Okay. Afternoon, everybody. My name is Diego, and this is my proposal. So I'm going to start with my Candela study. My Candela study was a particularly interesting one. It's located in Mexico DF, and it has this break between a high part and a curve. So what we discussed is that this is a perfect example of what a hybrid is, because the way that he actually resolved this building was by dividing the geometry. If you guys, if you recall from the previous project that Kevin had, which was the Bacardi bottle company, it was all curves and then creating that high part. But in here, in this case, it is it's slightly cut off by this triangular shape in here, which creates this geometry. Now, for the study of my cube, I began by starting with just that simple geometry, the triangle, and then offsetting it and using just one single point to connect the curve and the actual angles. And as you see below and here on the left-hand side, these are the shapes that were generated by this cube, and these are the shapes that I began using to draw on the site itself. These are some photos of the cues that were made previously to the final one. And the site that I've picked, it's in relation with mostly a residential area. It's to the south of it. We have the library, the Queen's Library, and then to the north side of it we have the famous Pepsi Cola sign on it. In this site in particular, I began analyzing just what was existing, the green areas, which are just huge, vastly green areas that can be for multi-use. And there's a couple of public spaces and plazas, and specifically playgrounds around the area as well. So this site, the way that it behaves, it's very diverse in the sense of it gives back to the community, and it also kind of acts as a private space for those residents in the buildings behind it, but still acting as a public space for all of those wandering around the site as well. For now attempting to do the programming, I began drawing the geometric shapes produced by the cube and obtruding them to see what kind of shapes I can create. For this particular highlighted area, this is the design skating area, where I'm using some of the offsets of the lines and some of the offsets of the drawing from the cube in order to create those masses, in order to create those openings as well for some of the skating rinks, as well as using some of the existing geometries and maybe seeing what I can do with the offsets of it, or maybe the negative space of it. So creating underground outdoor classrooms and theaters for the site. and just highlighting some of the connections between how would I connect this masses together, how these masses come together, and what kind of shapes I can connect them with. So again, just emphasizing more on just the lines and trying to use those as what's existing. For the program, highlighting just what I envisioned this to be, as you can see in there. And just for the points of access of this, for the facility, going back to the actual site, I wanted to keep actually not distort anything that was already existing, specifically the pathways, because I found them essential to how people would enter this building and enter not just the facilities, but enter actually the skating park as well. So I wanted to have as much openness and not to disrupt anything that was already existing in there. Just more of a view of the site and of the shapes generated. And then in the floor plan, I began articulating and refining some of the spaces taken from the geometry of the cube. So I did not necessarily use the entireness of all the line drawings, but from some of them, I extruded them and then creating some spaces. So I can use them to generate smaller spaces or bigger spaces as I needed them to be. So here, just going to some of the sections, you can see how that cube geometry is really translated into some of these spaces that I've designed. And some of the spaces, actually, the connections and also some of the openings that are involved in this high parts per se are actually reflected on the geometry generated by the cube as well. And so I'm just gonna explain. So as you can see in the photo at the top, this in particular is also reflecting or mimicking per se the geometry of the cube that I showed earlier. So thus creating all these spaces and allowing these hypers to have light in them. So it's just an interior shot of what this hyper spaces can create. In here, just to be a little bit underdeveloped, but this grand staircase would have on the sides desks incorporated into here in order to have that effect that people can still use that for multi-use. And underneath that, that will be where your outdoor classroom will be. And at the picture below, some of the skating rims actually are underneath this high parts at the top. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Diego. Click backwards through some of these renderings for us.
Sure.
Go back one. Yeah, this is interesting. Tell me real quick what's happening in with these lines right here. Is that just a line of a window, or is there a floor that's?
No, that's the line of the window. Yes.
Okay. And this has come a long way in these renderings. It's great to see. Can you show us, do you have like an overall view that's rendered?
Not an overall, no, just pieces of sections of the entire site.
One thing that I thought was happening, and it sort of seemed to kind of be promised in the in one of, at least one of the site drawings that you showed, that I thought was kind of compelling. When you showed some images of the models that you had taken in sunlight, and you were sort of projecting shadows out of that thing. I thought what was being shown in some of the site plans was actually starting to project line back up. I think it just, oh, that one.
Yeah.
Go forward. I go that and then go forward one into the site plan. Keep going. That back. Sorry. Yeah, maybe that one of those. But it seemed like was there a strategy sort of projecting lines in an oblique way out of these high pars into the landscape? just as an operational kind of like method?
Yeah, well, to be honest, this was a completely, at the beginning, a random placements of these lines. Like I said before, I started with this geometry of my cube underneath here. And I just begun placing them places, connecting them to probably some of the walkways. Also, this one's right here and this one's right here, which are divided. And then I use that triangle in order to create the shapes. So given the fact is that some of these lines, they were placed there, and some of them actually I connected them to, for instance, the Pepsi Cola sign, which is on top of here, and trying to connect this high part in order to the library, which is down here. So just trying to connect some views and some angles to what's existing in there already.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that makes sense. But I mean, my question was a little bit different than that, but I appreciate that approach. I think one of the things, like even when Nick's question about the window, when you start to slice these high pars in a way that doesn't necessarily follow an overall figure, you get new figures kind of emerging. And so I was just kind of trying to tease out if there were not some secondary kind of operations inside of this project, and there are, but like those could be something that you could explicitly build on to sort of develop other aspects of the project. And so like projection is one of those, or slicing in a way that's not quite in keeping with the overall figure is enough to generate new things. And so I think those are some areas that I think you can kind of build upon as you think about the project.
Yeah, I think just referring to what you said to the slicing of some of these spaces, yeah, some of them I actually just slice them to see if I can disrupt the actual high part itself. For instance, when I spoke about this one in particular, like what Professor GELPI said, yeah, I was just trying to see how can I disrupt this effect that goes like this, because technically this would just be a wall that's covering that high part. So I thought maybe there's a way that I can incorporate some other type of material or some other type of effect going on in there. So I was just playing around with that, seeing what that might come.
Yeah,
I think you should build on that personally.
Yeah, there's something I think in the way the renderings appear that makes me imagine this almost like, especially with the cube project, the way you approached it, like what if you just like came up with a pattern of lines on the site and then designed it as one continuous roof, and then began like one continuous candelized roof, and then you just started to use a different kind of logic to divide it up, whether it's voids or whether it's something else. And it feels like that's almost like what you ended up with. And this isn't the best image. There's one that was sort of in spaces that was back. Can you go back one? That one. Yeah. Yeah, the one after this, the one, but those spaces between, yeah, like between that weird, like there's this sort of weird vaulted one, and then there's one that's kind of generally got a flat, sort of faceted look, and then there's one that looks kind of massive, and there's a nice range of stuff happening in there. And I think maybe you sort of backed into it with the way that you built this thing bottom up, but I wonder if there was a way to like just sort of think about the whole site as a series of vaults and roofs that then you sort of program and then cut away at.
I think so, Diego. I'm happy to see it here. It's come a long way. I think for me, part of the problem is all these pieces feel loosely oriented to one another. And I'm kind of missing the continuity of like what Mark and Claire are suggesting. And, exactly those lines that you project on the site, to be precise, where are the boundaries? It's hard to even know like where your project starts and ends, because we're always in these views where you're just in it. And maybe that's, a concerted strategy on your part, but I would love to see like what part of this site do you really capture? I mean, you're grabbing the part with the historic Pepsi Cola sign, I think. You gotta incorporate that. Like, what are the given lines that exist that you're incorporating and transitioning between? Because your high pars, unlike the others from the other projects, really allow someone to take an existing edge, invent a new edge, and then connect them with these surfaces. but yours, they kind of remain like hats that are like dropped onto the site, right?
Right.
And they don't, because they're like maybe three-sided instead of four-sided, you don't have the opportunity for one of those edges to line up with something like the street grid or the site's edge or a pedestrian path or something like that. I like some of these moves like down here at the bottom where you're starting to terrace and you know, sculpt the edge towards the river. I think that's a great move, full of a lot of potential. But some of the geometries to me are, you know, maybe it's just the view. You know, it's hard to see the consistency of them. I like these as a reference, but I actually like these a lot. I think there's something interesting happening here. I'm just not clear where they're coming from or what they are. But I think in those, you've kind of found your own in between, you know, the Candela precedent and something else here on the site. So, you know, good work. I mean, some projects come together faster than others, and you know, it was a process, and you worked through it, and you got here, you know, and I'm happy to see it.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, this process was difficult because between me and Professor, it was kind of difficult to actually figure out how Felix Candela designed my precedent, because we could not figure out if it was a truly hyper or if it was something else. It was just really interesting. And that's why I did not want to give up on this forms, because it was such an interesting form that I wanted to give it a shot.
Yeah, and it's worth mentioning, Diego, for your booklet. Put it in there. You know, for Clay and Mark, you probably know this, but what's interesting about Candela, he never drew any curves. He only modeled with straight lines, and then the curves were resultant of using those straight lines. So it's such an interesting like distance that is maintained between curvature, you know, and geometry. It's great. And then Diego's has such an abundance of curvature. I do still think ultimately, although we couldn't figure it out, we really could not figure it out where these forms come from. We tried to work through it, but maybe Albert knows. But anyway, this was a tough one. So thanks, Diego. I want to keep us moving. But great work, man.
Yeah, thank you so much.
All right. Next up is Rich. We got 3 more guys, and then ordinarily there would be like an open bar with bottles of champagne. So smoke them at home if you have them. You know, so 3 more.
I'm way ahead of you.
You have to update your profile photo, dude. Okay, take it away, Rich.
Good afternoon. I'm Rich Jaffe. And my computer's going a little bit slow here.